Selina Wang begins our coverage out front live in Beijing. And Selina, you have been covering this now for a long time. You have seen this build up. You're there in Beijing in person. How are authorities responding tonight?
Well, when I went to those protests in Beijing, those people there, they were determined to make their voices heard. But at the same time, as you showed there, China's giant censorship machine is in overdrive, determined to make it as if those protests never happened, erasing videos, comments of the protests across the country on all Chinese social media platforms. State media, meanwhile, completely ignoring it all and publishing headlines reiterating that zero COVID is scientific and effective. But the protesters in China know that this is the system they're up against.
They chant, "Xi Jinping, step down," an extraordinary show of defiance in China. In Shanghai, they chant for freedom, democracy, and end to COVID lockdowns, even targeting the Communist Party and the Supreme Leader himself. Unprecedented protests are erupting across China, from major metropolises to elite college campuses, even far-flung cities. Searing nationwide anger triggered by a deadly fire in China's far west Xinjiang region. Water unable to actually reach the fire blazing from the high floor of the apartment building. Videos indicate COVID restrictions prevented fire trucks from getting close enough, apparently blocked by fences and metal barriers normally used during lockdowns. In the building's chat group, a mother pleads, "Help us, my kids are dying. We don't have enough oxygen." At least 10 people died. The nation grieving the deaths of victims that likely spent the last months of their lives trapped in that building. Most of Xinjiang has been locked down for more than 100 days. The protests even spilling into the capital.
They're chanting that they don't want COVID tests, they want freedom. And many people are also holding white papers in their hands, which is a sign of solidarity against censorship.
They sing and cheer, shout to be unsealed, and some even break down into tears. A man with a loudspeaker shouts, "We always support the Communist Party, but we want democracy and freedom." I asked a protester how he was feeling. Overwhelmed, he said. All conscientious Chinese people should come here and stand together. I said, "You realize there's a risk being here." "Of course there is," he responded.
And if we just turn the camera around, you'll see there is a row of police.
Hours later, masses of police filed in, pushing the protesters back. Demonstrators shout towards the authorities, "We are not your enemy. We are in this together." These are unbelievable scenes in China, where public criticism of the party can lead to prison time or even worse. In Shanghai, police arrested roughed-up protesters, violently dragging them into cars. No protests of this scale demanding political reforms have been seen since the Tiananmen pro-democracy protests in 1989 that led to a massacre of unarmed protesters. These demonstrators know what they're risking, but they're determined to make their voices heard. And Aaron, there is now a heavy security presence in places where there have been protests, including here in Beijing. Last night, I went back to that exact place where I was the day before there at the protest, and we filmed video. When we drove by, you can see that it's eerily quiet with a giant row of police vans parked with their lights flashing. This is a stark reminder that this is a police state with far-reaching security, surveillance capabilities. It's also a country where social media like Facebook and Twitter are banned. The main messaging platform is monitored by authorities. It's not easy for protesters to communicate, mobilize, and continue to have their voices heard in China. But while the authorities, they can snuff out evidence within China of what's happened here, that anger, well, it's not going away.
Incredible. All right. Thank you so much, Selina Wang, as you can see, in Beijing and was at the protest there this weekend. It is stunning, Selina, showing that image of the day after, just with all those lights on and completely blocking off. I want to go now to Yanjun Huang, who's a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of Toxic Politics, China's Environmental Health Crisis and its Challenge to the Chinese State, along with Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of the Eurasia Group and the author of The Power of Crisis. So, Ian, you know, it is really amazing seeing Selina there on the streets, right, amidst protesters, one of them, you know, even willing to speak, right, even willing to take that risk to speak out. And then seeing them, you know, so snuffed out the next day. But this is now across China. Why is Xi Jinping willing to risk all this unrest and these protests and the economy, all for zero COVID?
Well, first of all, I think it comes as a surprise to him. I mean, a couple of weeks ago when he was in Bali and doing bilateral meetings with other heads of state, he wasn't talking about zero COVID. He wasn't expressing a lot of concern about it. I think that if he'd been honest, he wouldn't have thought that he was going to get these sorts of demonstrations spontaneously from students, from workers, from the middle classes in cities across the country. But also he's backed into it, right? Because, I mean, you do not have vaccines that in adequate numbers that work for the population at large, and most of the oldest haven't had a vaccine in a couple of years now. The hospitals aren't capable of dealing with massive and unmitigated spread. So they're a bit backed into a corner by a policy that worked very well the first year they implemented it, and abysmally poorly as we stand right now.
So, Yanjun, China's official news agency, Xinhua, published an op-ed Monday that echoes something that Selina just said, that she said is all over state media, and that is that the COVID measures are, quote, scientific and effective. So from a public health standpoint, is zero COVID right now necessary to control COVID in China? If you buy that you want to control it, is zero COVID the way they're doing it the right way to do it?
No, it's from a public health perspective, it's no longer justifiable. I think even the Chinese leading public health experts agree that the virus, but it's now it's in terms of virulence has been much less severe than the original strain. And if you also look at real world data, from Shanghai to Guangzhou, and now the nationwide data, it's more than 95% of the cases are symptomatic, and very few actually are severe cases.
So, Ian, yet they continue with these lockdowns, you know, where we've now seen reports of 87,000 beds being readied for people who are going to have to be quarantined because cases are hitting record highs. I want to show again some of the video of these protests because it is so incredible to see this in cities across China. This video is now there. We can see it, right? Selina even filmed some of it herself, right? We can see it even though it's being banned in China. What will the Chinese government do? What will Xi Jinping do if the protests don't stop?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this is the exact opposite of the message that Xi Jinping wants domestically as well as around the world. The last time you and I talked about China on air, it was about Hu Jintao and how Xi Jinping was displaying such extraordinary capacity to basically stifle and emasculate the former president of the country. Now, he has suddenly these demonstrations, some of which are even calling for his ouster. There's no chance he's going to allow that to persist for weeks on end. I think there'll be carrot and stick. There'll be some local officials that will be removed for poor implementation of zero COVID. There'll probably be loosening in the way that zero COVID is actually laid out and policed. Compared to what we've seen over the past weeks and months. But there's also going to be a clear crackdown against further demonstrations, especially those that have an overt political message to them. I can't imagine they would allow that to continue.
Yeah, right. Some of those chants, right? They included words of freedom, democracy. Some even mentioning Xi Jinping himself, right? Others more specifically about COVID itself. Yanjun, one question that I have and just can't get my head around is this. If Xi Jinping is capable of locking down a country of more than 1 billion people for 3 years, essentially, which is what he has successfully done, why couldn't he just mandate the vaccine for everybody, especially the elderly population?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, he's not sure about the Chinese vaccine. actually that effective in terms of even preventing severe cases. Not to mention, right, the vaccines are much less effective in terms of preventing infection. So even though they have 90% of the population being vaccinated with 2 doses, this much of that were done before March. So now most people, the antibody level have dropped to a level that is very low or undetectable now. And the zero COVID, we know the policy cannot tolerate any infections. So even the best vaccines cannot guarantee 100% protection. So I think that is the reason he was not so sure, but it is a good idea to mandate the vaccine on the elderly, because it won't necessarily help achieve the zero COVID objective.